Some letters are never lost. They simply wait until our hearts are finally ready to read them. I found mine 10 years too late on a quiet Saturday morning when I returned to Hawthorne University for our alumni reunion. The campus looked smaller than I remembered, yet somehow every brick walkway, every maple tree, and every stone building carried the same familiar warmth that had once felt like home. Students hurried past with backpacks slung over one shoulder, laughing about classes, weekend plans, and futures they had not yet imagined. Watching them felt like opening a window into another lifetime, one where everything still seemed possible. My name is Ethan Carter. I am 28 years old, and I make a living capturing moments through a camera lens. Weddings, family portraits, quiet landscapes at sunrise. I have spent years preserving memories for strangers while carefully avoiding my own. That morning I wandered through the old library simply because it had always been my favorite place on campus. It smelled exactly the same as it had 10 years earlier, filled with old paper, polished oak shelves, and fresh coffee drifting from the small cafe by the entrance. The librarian smiled when she recognized the alumni badge hanging around my neck and mentioned that the university had recently begun cleaning out abandoned student mailboxes before renovating the building. On a nearby table rested several worn cardboard boxes filled with forgotten envelopes waiting to be claimed. Most people walked past without a second glance. I almost did the same. Then I noticed my name written across an ivory envelope in neat handwriting that instantly stirred something deep inside me. Ethan Carter. The ink had faded slightly, but the careful curves of every letter remained unmistakably familiar. My hands froze before I even touched it. In the upper left corner was another name that made the entire room disappear around me. Noah Bennett. I had not spoken that name aloud in nearly a decade. We had met during freshman orientation after accidentally reaching for the same campus map. He laughed first. I apologized first. Somehow that awkward little moment became 4 years of friendship that quietly shaped who I became. Noah could turn an ordinary Tuesday into something worth remembering. He played old songs on the piano in the student union, knew every shortcut across campus, and somehow convinced me to join sunrise walks even though I hated waking up early. He talked enough for both of us, while I listened more than I spoke. We never defined what we were. Maybe we never had the courage to ask. I slowly turned the envelope over. The seal had never been broken. Across the back, written in smaller letters, was a single sentence that made my heartbeat stumble. If you are reading this, it means I finally ran out of courage. I stood perfectly still as sunlight poured through the library windows, dust floating gently in the air like tiny memories refusing to settle. Around me, students continued living ordinary lives, unaware that one unopened letter had just quietly changed mine forever. I slipped the envelope into my jacket pocket without opening it. Somehow it felt wrong to read something so deeply personal while standing in the middle of the library where our story had quietly begun. Outside, the campus buzzed with the cheerful energy of reunion weekend. Alumni greeted former professors with warm embraces, old classmates laughed over coffee, and families wandered beneath rows of maple trees whose leaves had just begun to turn shades of gold and crimson. Everything around me celebrated the passage of time, yet I felt completely suspended inside it. My feet carried me almost automatically toward the small coffee shop beside the music building. 10 years earlier, Noah and I had spent countless afternoons there pretending to study while talking about everything except our assignments. I ordered the same caramel latte I used to drink back then, even though my taste had changed years ago. The young barista handed me the cup with a smile that reminded me how quickly one generation quietly replaces another. I chose the corner table beside the window where Noah always insisted the afternoon light was perfect. He used to joke that every beautiful conversation deserved beautiful lighting. I smiled despite myself. That was exactly the kind of thing he would say. I carefully turned the envelope over again. The paper had grown slightly brittle with age, but Noah's handwriting still looked steady and thoughtful, every letter carefully spaced, as though he had rewritten my name several times before settling on the final version. I remembered watching him fill pages of his journal while sitting beneath the giant oak tree outside the student center. He was always writing something. Song lyrics, funny observations, tiny stories about strangers, birthday cards that somehow sounded like poetry. Whenever I asked what he was working on, he would grin, close the notebook, and say, Nothing worth reading yet. I never pushed him. Looking back, I wondered how many things had remained hidden simply because neither of us knew how to ask better questions. My fingers rested lightly on the seal for several long moments before I finally opened it with the greatest care I had ever given a piece of paper. Inside was a single folded letter written on cream-colored stationery. At the top, in the same familiar handwriting, was the date. May 22nd, 10 years ago, the day before graduation. My chest tightened. I had spent that entire day helping pack camera equipment for the university newspaper because I believed there would always be another chance to see Noah before we left campus. I remembered texting him that evening, but he never replied. The following morning, graduation swept us into different crowds, different conversations, and eventually different cities. We hugged outside the auditorium, promised to stay in touch, and somehow allowed life to quietly carry us in opposite directions. I unfolded the first page, and my eyes landed on the opening sentence. Dear Ethan, if you are reading this today, then I finally found the courage to tell you something I have been trying to say since the autumn of our freshman year. I stopped reading. My hands began to tremble so gently that coffee rippled inside the paper cup beside me. Across the courtyard, students laughed as they hurried toward their next class, completely unaware that a single sentence had just reopened a chapter of my life that I had believed was finished forever. I forced myself to keep reading, even though every sentence felt heavier than the last. Noah had never written with dramatic words. That was not who he was. His thoughts flowed the same way he lived, quietly, honestly, and with a warmth that made ordinary moments feel unforgettable. You probably never noticed, he wrote, but every time you walked into the library carrying that old camera around your neck, I somehow forgot what I was supposed to be studying. I told myself it was because you looked interesting. Later I realized it was because you made every place feel a little brighter. I smiled before tears blurred the ink. That old camera had followed me everywhere during college. I thought people remembered the photographs I took. I had never imagined someone remembered the way I carried the camera itself. Noah continued writing about little moments I had completely forgotten. The afternoon we got caught in an unexpected rainstorm and ended up sharing a booth inside the campus diner while our soaked jackets dried over the backs of our chairs. The evening we stayed in the music building long after everyone else had gone home because he wanted me to hear a melody he had just finished composing. The morning we watched the first snowfall from the library steps without saying much because neither of us wanted to disturb the silence. He remembered details I had lost somewhere inside the busy years that followed graduation. He even remembered the way I always stirred my coffee exactly 3 times before taking the first sip. Reading his words felt less like opening a letter and more like stepping into a room where every forgotten memory had been carefully waiting for me. I realized something that made my heart ache with quiet regret. While I had spent years believing I was simply documenting our college life through photographs, Noah had been documenting it through his heart. Every ordinary day had meant something to him. Every conversation had become another page in a story he never believed would have an ending. I turned to the second page. I almost told you during sophomore year, he wrote. Then I thought maybe graduation would be better because I did not want to risk losing the best friendship I had ever known. If you never feel the same way, I hope we still spend years laughing over coffee somewhere. I closed my eyes for a long moment. We had spent years laughing over coffee. We simply stopped before either of us understood how precious those afternoons really were. My mind drifted back to our final semester. Noah had seemed quieter than usual, but I assumed he was worried about finding a teaching job after graduation. I had been consumed by internship applications, photography portfolios, and the excitement of moving to New York. Looking back now, I could see dozens of moments that suddenly carried completely different meanings. The lingering glances, the conversations that seemed to stop just before becoming something more. The way he always looked as though he wanted to say one final thing before we walked in different directions. None of it had felt obvious then. Now every memory fit together as naturally as pieces of a photograph finally coming into focus. I looked around the coffee shop and noticed students studying together, smiling over shared laptops, and scribbling notes across open textbooks. They reminded me so much of us that it almost felt impossible 10 years had passed. I gently folded the letter closed for a moment and whispered Noah's name under my breath. It no longer sounded like someone from my past. It sounded like someone I had never truly stopped carrying with me. even when I believed I had moved on. I unfolded the final page with the same care someone might use when handling an old photograph that could never be replaced. Noah's handwriting remained steady until the very end, but I could almost imagine him pausing between sentences, searching for words that never felt quite brave enough. "If life takes us in different directions after tomorrow," he wrote, "I hope you never stop chasing light with your camera. You always saw beauty where everyone else saw ordinary things. I think that is why I fell for you without even noticing it at first." I stared at those words for a long time. Outside the cafe window, late afternoon sunlight filtered through golden leaves, casting moving shadows across the brick walkway where students hurried toward their next class. 10 years earlier, Noah and I had walked that same path almost every day. Suddenly, another memory returned with remarkable clarity. It was the final afternoon before graduation. Noah had asked if I wanted to meet beneath the old oak tree near the student center after my photography meeting. I remembered glancing at my phone while packing camera equipment and replying that I would try my best because everything was running behind schedule. By the time I finally reached the oak tree, the benches were empty. I waited for nearly 20 minutes before assuming he had left. I sent a message asking where he was, but it remained unread. The next morning, graduation swept everyone into rehearsals, photographs, family celebrations, and endless congratulations. We found each other only once outside the auditorium. Noah smiled exactly the way he always had, warm enough to make every crowded place feel smaller. We hugged, promised to keep in touch, and laughed about finally becoming real adults. Neither of us mentioned the meeting beneath the oak tree. Neither of us mentioned anything that truly mattered. Reading his letter now revealed what had actually happened. I waited under the tree for almost an hour. Noah had written. The letter was in my backpack the entire time. Every person who walked by made me think it might be you. When the sun started setting, I realized I was more afraid of changing our friendship than I was of losing my chance. I carried the letter back to my dorm and told myself maybe tomorrow would be easier. I quietly rested my forehead against my folded hands. Tomorrow had never come. Graduation had scattered us into separate lives before either of us found the courage to try again. Noah accepted a teaching position in Boston. I moved to New York with little more than a camera, 2 suitcases, and dreams that seemed much bigger than my understanding of life. We exchanged a few messages during the first year, then birthdays, then holiday greetings, and eventually nothing at all. Not because we stopped caring, but because silence slowly became its own routine. I reached into my wallet and found the old student identification card I had somehow carried through every move without thinking about it. There we were in the tiny photograph, standing shoulder to shoulder during freshman orientation, both smiling awkwardly into the camera as though the future had already decided our paths without bothering to tell us. I looked back at Noah's final sentence. Maybe some stories are not meant to end at graduation. Maybe they simply wait until 2 people become brave enough to begin again. For the first time in 10 years, hope quietly replaced regret. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it back into its envelope, opened my phone, and searched for the one name I had convinced myself belonged only to my past. I stared at the contact information on my phone for several seconds before realizing I had nothing to search. Noah had disappeared from every social media account years ago, and the old number I still remembered by heart had long since been disconnected. For a brief moment, I wondered if the letter had arrived exactly as it was meant to, not to reunite us, but simply to remind me of a life that could have been. Then I remembered something Noah used to say whenever one of my photographs did not turn out the way I hoped. If the first path does not lead you there, maybe it is just pointing you toward the better one. I smiled softly. He always believed every ending quietly contained another beginning. I returned to the Alumni Welcome Center where volunteers were helping former students reconnect with old classmates. A cheerful woman wearing a university volunteer badge looked up from her laptop and asked whether she could help me find someone. Saying Noah's name aloud after so many years felt strangely comforting instead of painful. She searched through the reunion registration list before shaking her head with an apologetic smile. "He is not attending this weekend," she said. I thanked her anyway and turned to leave before she added one more sentence. "He did leave something for the university music department a few years ago. I remember because he comes back every spring to host workshops for local students." My heart lifted in a way I had not expected. He still came back here. Maybe not today, But he had never completely left this place either. Before driving home, I wandered one last time through the music building where Noah had spent countless evenings practicing the piano after classes. The rehearsal rooms were quieter now, but faint melodies drifted through the hallway from somewhere upstairs. I stopped outside the small recital hall and noticed a framed photograph hanging near the entrance. It showed Noah standing beside a group of smiling elementary school children holding violins and recorders after a community music program. His smile had not changed at all. It was the same smile that once convinced me to skip studying for an hour just to watch the sunset from the campus hill. Beneath the photograph was a small plaque thanking him for volunteering every spring to encourage young musicians. I found myself laughing quietly because it was exactly the life I imagined he would build. He had always believed music could make frightened people feel brave. I reached into my backpack, pulled out my camera, and took one photograph of the empty hallway glowing beneath the warm afternoon light. It reminded me of the thousands of ordinary moments Noah had taught me to notice instead of rushing past. As I lowered the camera, I realized something had changed inside me. For 10 years I believed regret was something permanent, something you carried like an invisible weight that never became lighter. Yet standing there, I understood regret could also become gratitude if you allowed it to guide your next decision instead of trapping you in the last one. Before leaving campus, I stopped beneath the old oak tree where we had almost changed our lives a decade earlier. The benches had been replaced, but the tree stood exactly as I remembered, its branches stretching wide across the afternoon sky. I sat there for a while with Noah's letter resting in my hands until an idea came so naturally that it felt as though it had been waiting beside me all along. Instead of wondering whether fate would bring us together again, I would write the first letter I should have written 10 years ago, and this time I would make certain it found its way to him. I spent the entire flight back to New York thinking about words instead of photographs. Usually, when I traveled for work, my camera bag occupied the seat beside me, and my thoughts revolved around lighting, composition, and the next assignment waiting on my calendar. This time the camera remained zipped shut beneath the seat, while Noah's letter rested inside my jacket pocket, close enough that I caught myself touching it every few minutes as if to make sure it was still real. By the time the plane landed, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. That evening I unlocked my apartment overlooking the Hudson River, placed my suitcase by the door, and walked directly to the small wooden desk beside the living room window. It was the same desk where I had edited thousands of photographs over the years. Yet for the first time, it was not pictures I wanted to create. It was honesty. I opened a blank sheet of stationery instead of my laptop because Noah had reminded me that some things deserve to be written by hand. My pen hovered above the paper for several minutes before the first sentence finally appeared. Dear Noah, I think this letter is only 10 years late. I laughed quietly to myself after writing it. Somehow the simple sentence carried more truth than anything I could have planned. The words that followed came more easily than I expected. I told him about the alumni reunion, the forgotten mailbox, the moment I recognized his handwriting, and how every page had brought back memories I thought had disappeared forever. I admitted something I had never been brave enough to admit, even to myself. During college, I had often found reasons to spend more time with him than anyone else. I had looked forward to every coffee break, every photography walk, every late evening conversation inside the library, but I convinced myself that what I felt was simply gratitude for an extraordinary friendship. Reading his letter had not created new feelings. It had simply given a name to feelings I had never understood. I paused only once, looking toward the framed photograph sitting beside my desk. It showed the two of us during senior year standing beneath blooming cherry trees, both laughing because the wind had blown my graduation cap into a fountain moments before the picture was taken. We looked so young, not because of our faces, but because we believed time would always wait for us. I finished the letter just before midnight. Instead of making promises or asking impossible questions, I ended with something much simpler. If life has already taken you somewhere beautiful, I will be grateful just knowing you found happiness. But if you still believe some stories deserve another chapter, I would love to buy you a cup of coffee beneath the old oak tree this spring. I folded the pages carefully, placed them inside an envelope, and addressed it using the mailing information I found through the elementary school music program listed on the university website. The following morning, I walked 3 blocks to the neighborhood post office before work. The woman behind the counter smiled as she weighed the envelope and placed a small stamp in the upper corner. It disappeared into the outgoing mail bin with dozens of ordinary letters headed toward ordinary destinations. Mine did not feel ordinary at all. As I stepped back onto the sidewalk, the cool autumn air carried the scent of roasted coffee from a nearby cafe. I looked up at the bright blue sky and realized something remarkable. For the first time in 10 years, I was no longer waiting for courage to find me. I had finally chosen to send it myself. I expected waiting to be the hardest part, but life has a quiet way of continuing even while your heart lingers somewhere else. The days filled themselves with photography sessions, editing deadlines, train rides across the city, and ordinary conversations that somehow felt different after mailing that letter. Every afternoon, when I returned to my apartment, I glanced toward the small mailbox in the lobby before taking the elevator upstairs. Most days there were only utility bills, magazines, or advertisements folded neatly inside. Each evening I reminded myself that Boston was several hundred miles away and that people carried lives far more complicated than unanswered letters. Still, hope has a stubborn habit of returning every morning. Nearly 3 weeks passed before an unfamiliar envelope finally appeared among the usual stack of mail. I recognized the handwriting before I even picked it up. The careful spacing, the gentle curves, the same quiet patience that had once written my name across an unopened envelope hidden inside a forgotten university mailbox. I carried it upstairs without opening it, making myself a fresh cup of coffee first. Somehow the moment deserved the same respect Noah had given his own words all those years ago. I sat beside the living room window where late afternoon sunlight stretched across the wooden floor, then carefully unfolded the pages inside. Dear Ethan, it began. I almost convinced myself I had imagined you. Then your letter arrived, and suddenly 10 years disappeared in the time it took me to read the first sentence. I smiled so naturally that I did not even realize it until my cheeks began to ache. Noah wrote about the life he had built in Boston. He described teaching music to elementary school students who believed every instrument held a different personality. He told me about Saturday mornings spent volunteering at community concerts, evenings walking along the Charles River with a cup of hot chocolate during winter, and how he still returned to Hawthorne University every spring because the campus reminded him that hope often begins in ordinary places. Then his letter became quieter. There were moments when I wondered if I should have searched harder for you, he admitted. But every year that passed made the silence feel heavier. Eventually, I stopped believing I had missed my chance. I started believing perhaps our story had simply become a beautiful memory. Your letter reminded me that memories are not always the end of a story. Sometimes they are the beginning of the chapter we were not ready to write before. My eyes drifted toward the skyline outside my window as I read those words again. They carried no bitterness, no blame, only the calm honesty that had always made Noah different from everyone else I had ever known. At the very end, he wrote something so simple that it somehow meant everything. I will be back at the university next Saturday to lead the annual spring music workshop. If you still want that cup of coffee beneath the old oak tree, I will be there at 10 o'clock. This time, I promise I will wait as long as it takes. I folded the letter slowly and looked at the calendar hanging above my desk. Next Saturday was only 6 days away. For the first time since graduation, the future no longer felt like something that had carried us apart. It felt like a road quietly leading us back toward the place where 2 young men had once believed they had all the time in the world, and where 2 older, wiser versions of themselves were finally ready to arrive on time. I arrived at Hawthorne University almost an hour early. Old habits die slowly, especially after spending 10 years regretting one afternoon when I had been late. The morning air carried the fresh scent of spring blossoms, and gentle sunlight filtered through the branches of the old oak tree that had quietly watched generations of students arrive, dream, and move on. The campus felt alive again. Young couples crossed the lawn carrying backpacks instead of worries. Friends laughed outside the student union while someone practiced the piano inside the nearby music building, the melody drifting softly across the courtyard just as it had years before. I stood beneath the tree with my camera hanging around my neck, not because I planned to take photographs, but because it had always felt like a part of who I was whenever Noah was nearby. Every few minutes I checked my watch, then laughed at myself. There was nothing left to rush. At exactly 10 o'clock, I heard familiar footsteps crunching across the gravel path behind me. Before I turned around, I somehow already knew it was him. Some people leave your daily life, but they never leave your memory. I slowly looked over my shoulder and found Noah standing a few yards away, holding 2 paper coffee cups with the same gentle smile that had lived in my memories for an entire decade. His hair was slightly shorter now. A few faint lines rested beside his eyes, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years helping others grow. Yet he was unmistakably the same Noah who once believed every ordinary day deserved beautiful music. Neither of us hurried forward. We simply stood there smiling like 2 people allowing reality to catch up with hope. Finally, Noah lifted one of the coffee cups with a playful grin. "I remembered," he said softly. "Caramel latte. You always stirred it exactly 3 times before taking the first sip." I could not help laughing. "You still remember that?" He shrugged with the same easy warmth I had missed for far too long. "Some things are worth remembering." We sat together beneath the oak tree, letting conversation return naturally instead of forcing it to fill 10 years of silence all at once. We talked about his students who proudly performed their first concerts, about the elderly couples I photographed every autumn, about cities that had shaped us and small routines that quietly made life meaningful. There was no awkwardness. No need to explain every missing year. The friendship that had once grown through thousands of ordinary conversations somehow recognized its own rhythm again within minutes. At one point, Noah reached into his messenger bag and smiled almost shyly. "I almost forgot," he said. He handed me a small notebook with a worn leather cover. Inside were dozens of handwritten pages. "I never stopped writing," he admitted. "Not every page is about you, but many of them began because of you." I looked up from the notebook and found him watching me with calm honesty instead of uncertainty. For the first time, neither of us was hiding behind fear. The spring breeze carried cherry blossom petals gently across the grass as students wandered past without realizing they had become quiet witnesses to a story that had finally found the courage to continue where it had once paused. We remained beneath the old oak tree until the afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the campus lawn, talking with the ease of 2 people who had finally stopped measuring time by what they had lost and started noticing what still remained. Noah showed me pages from his notebook, and each one carried the same quiet kindness that had filled the letter I found inside the forgotten mailbox. Some pages described ordinary afternoons in Boston after his students left for the day. Others captured memories of our college years so vividly that I could almost hear the laughter echoing through the library again. There were stories about rainy walks across campus, coffee cups balanced on stacks of textbooks, autumn leaves caught in the wind, and the evening we sat on the hill watching the city lights appear one by one, without realizing those ordinary moments would become the memories we treasured most. I listened more than I spoke, just as I always had, but this time silence no longer hid fear. It simply made room for understanding. Before long, we wandered through the campus together, revisiting the places that had quietly shaped our lives. We stopped outside the photography studio where I had developed my first black and white prints. We paused inside the music building where Noah smiled at an old piano that looked almost unchanged despite the passing years. A young student sat down and began playing a gentle melody that drifted through the hallway with remarkable warmth. Noah closed his eyes for a moment and whispered, "Some songs never really end. They simply wait for someone else to continue them." I realized our story had done exactly the same thing. As the afternoon faded toward evening, we found ourselves back beside the campus cafe where everything had begun once again. We ordered coffee, laughed about how much our tastes had changed, and smiled when I automatically stirred my caramel latte exactly 3 times before taking the first sip. No one noticed immediately, and neither of us needed to say why we were laughing. Some memories become part of who we are without asking permission. When it was finally time to leave, we walked slowly toward the parking lot, neither of us rushing to say goodbye. Instead of making promises we might fail to keep, we made simple plans that felt wonderfully real. Noah invited me to visit Boston the following month during one of his student concerts. I invited him to New York afterward so we could spend a weekend exploring museums, bookstores, and quiet streets with my camera hanging over one shoulder, just like the old days. The future no longer felt uncertain. It felt open. Before we reached our cars, I reached into my backpack and handed Noah a small envelope. "There is one more letter," I said with a smile. This one was written exactly when it needed to be. He opened it carefully and read only the first few lines before looking back at me with eyes brighter than I had ever remembered. I did not need to ask what he was thinking because his expression already held the answer. He stepped forward and wrapped me in a warm, unhurried embrace that felt less like the beginning of something new and more like finding the missing page of a story we had unknowingly carried with us for years. As I drove away from Hawthorne University that evening, I glanced one last time at the old oak tree standing quietly against the spring sky. 10 years earlier, we had walked away believing silence had written the ending. We were wrong. It was courage, however late it arrived, that finally wrote the chapter we had been waiting to live. Sometimes love is not measured by perfect timing or dramatic moments. Sometimes it grows patiently inside ordinary days, waits inside letters that are never sent, and quietly reminds us that the right words, spoken with an honest heart, can still find their way home no matter how much time has passed.